January 8, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson addressed Congress to present his plan for negotiating peace to conclude World War I. His plan consisted of 14 brief points, and the intention and scope of his plan extended beyond merely ending the war. He envisioned an outcome that would ensure world peace for generations. He truly wanted to form a new world order that would prevent future wars. This video will consider the role of religion in Wilson's life and how it influenced his vision for a new world order. In this video, we'll be discussing several topics in order to understand the role of religion in President Wilson's global vision and his development of the 14-point plan for world peace. First, we'll discuss religion as a lens through which to understand U.S. foreign policy or U.S. foreign relations. Then we'll examine several foundational religious concepts that shaped America's self-perceived role in the world. Third, we'll consider President Wilson's personal religious background and the sincerity of his religious practice. Then we will consider the global vision contained in the 14-point plan. After the 14-point plan, we'll briefly examine why the U.S. did not enter the League of Nations. Our examination will conclude with a few thoughts about President Wilson's vision for world peace. There is some objection regarding the validity of religion as a lens through which to view U.S. foreign policy or foreign relations. Yet one cannot understand U.S. foreign policy without understanding America's self-perceived role in the world, a self-understanding initially imprinted on the nation through strong religious influences. While the strength of religious conviction, religious identity, may be waning, or at least diluting in the 21st century, previous generations dearly held deep religious convictions. So while some may question whether religion matters today, it did matter to previous generations and significantly influenced America's national and social identity. Therefore, without looking through the religious lens, one cannot fully understand the historical context, thereby deeply hindering one's ability to understand U.S. foreign policy. In his book, Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, Andrew Preston presents 3 reasons for which U.S. policymakers could not ignore religion when making domestic and foreign policy. First, religion was important to the vast majority of people, many of whom became policymakers. Second, democracy in the U.S. meant that political and diplomatic elites could not ignore the will of the people, which was largely informed by their religious values. Third, the U.S. enjoyed free security, which provided the opportunity for Americans to dream about how the world should be. The American dream for the world would naturally apply religiously based American values to the world system. For this reason, we will now consider several foundational religious concepts embedded in the U.S. value system. Several foundational religious concepts undergird the U.S. worldview. Some of these predate the foundation of the nation, having been brought to the New World by the early settlers, the vast majority of whom were Protestant Christians who adhered to a strong Reformed theology, though not all held to Reformed beliefs. The first of the foundational religious concepts is liberty of conscience, very closely related to soul competency. Essentially, this is the idea that every single individual will stand in judgment before God and account for his or her own choices in life. In that sense, no government has the right to impose religious views upon people. Religious views must be actually decided upon by the individual. This leads us to the concept of freedom of religion, where every person has the right to choose their own religion or choose not to have a religion. Obviously, if you're dealing with the governmental aspect here, the separation of church and state comes into play very quickly, so that the state is not establishing a church or religion that other people actually have to attend or adhere to the beliefs of. This leads also into the concept of democracy on a religious belief level. Every individual should have a voice in how he or she is governed. Another foundational concept is the providence of God, the concept that God is at work. His invisible hand is moving things according to his will. This would apply to the providence of God in choosing people and or nations for specific purposes in the world. Another aspect, another religious foundational view is the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of mankind, or the sisterhood of mankind. Um, this includes the concept of all people being created equal. God is the creator, and everyone is created equal in his sight, of equal value, of equal dignity. Um, Therefore, there's a responsibility among humans, among people, to care for one another as God would have you care for others, and treating each other as neighbors, as brothers and sisters. Now, obviously, these foundational religious concepts were not perfectly implied throughout the history of the United States. Um, However, they are actually undergirding foundational religious views. And over time, we have seen many of these actually developed out so that they're applied better, more evenly, and more equitably. There is still room for improvement, and I hope we'll see that these foundational views are vital for understanding American values and how they're applied to U.S. foreign policy. One question that often comes up when considering politicians is whether they're speaking according to their own beliefs or if they're using religious language to play to the values of the people themselves. For that reason, we're going to look at a little of Woodrow Wilson's history and education to see if we can discern really the sincerity of his use of religious language. He earned a PhD in government from Johns Hopkins University in 1886. When he was elected president in 1913, he was the only U.S. president with an earned PhD, and it's a distinction that he maintains to this day. Before becoming president or entering politics, he taught at several universities, including Princeton University, of which he became president in 1902. Wilson completed undergraduate studies at the institution under its previous name, the College of New Jersey. During his time as a student at the College of New Jersey, he published several essays related to politics and his Christian beliefs, and we'll look at a couple of those essays a little further into the video. Wilson's own religious background presents quite a pedigree. Both of his grandfathers, his father, and an uncle were Presbyterian ministers, and he was a devoted Presbyterian elder. His religious heritage came from the Scottish Covenanters, who adhered to covenant theology, Reformed covenant theology. He believed deeply in the providence of God who chooses people and nations for divine purposes. This applied to the view that the United States was a city on a hill, a nation chosen to carry out God's will in the world. Two of Wilson's religious essays are of significant importance to our topic. The first is entitled A Christian Statesman. The second is entitled The Clergyman and the State. Both were written when Wilson was around 20 years old. Their content is reflected in Wilson's political philosophy throughout his life. In A Christian Statesman, Wilson expressed deep concern over the growing compartmentalization of sacred and secular. He believed that statesmen had a responsibility to both God and man, which led him to conclude that statesmen should be Christians. His Christian faith defined his understanding of moral responsibility. Wilson believed that abstaining from action or remaining silent in the face of injustice or falsehood did not eliminate a statesman's responsibility before God and man. Rather, truth and justice for all people are the purview of the statesman. In The Clergyman and the State, Wilson focuses more on the role of the clergyman, but has much to say about his view of the state as well. Wilson explained that the church, whether Protestant or Catholic, should provide the moral standard and example for the state. As well, the church should hold the state accountable to those moral standards. Within those moral standards, Wilson believed that all men before God are created equal. He concluded that ministers should set the moral example for statesmen. To this end, no one should be without accountability to high moral standards. Shortly after World War I began, President Wilson made an appeal to Americans for neutrality. His appeal reflects his vision for the role of the U.S. in the world. The U.S. population was made up of many immigrants from the nations at war. Internal conflict threatened the welfare of the nation, but also the ability of the nation to fulfill its divine mandate. Wilson stated in this address, "Such internal divisions among us would be fatal to our peace of mind and might seriously stand in the way of the proper performance of our duty as the one great nation at peace, the one people holding itself ready to play a part of impartial mediation and speak the counsels of peace and accommodation, not as a partisan, but as a friend. He continued, "Shall we not resolve to put upon ourselves the restraints which will bring to our people the happiness and the great and lasting influence for peace we covet for them?" In context, Wilson is speaking of national self-restraint for the benefit of the world to deliver peace and liberty to all mankind. By all indications, Wilson did not want to enter World War I. After the Imperial German government began using its submarines to indiscriminately sink all ships, Wilson no longer saw any way to remain neutral. Therefore, he addressed Congress on April 2, 1917, calling for a declaration of war. He wrote, "The present German submarine warfare against commerce is warfare against mankind. Our motive will not be revenge or the victorious assertion of physical might of the nation, but only the vindication of human right, of which we are only a single champion." He continued, "There is one choice we cannot make, we are incapable of making. We will not choose the path of submission and suffer the most sacred rights of our nation and our people to be ignored or violated. The wrongs against which we now array ourselves are no common wrongs. They cut to the very roots of human life." And in this section of the Declaration of War, we see Wilson really focusing on the brotherhood of mankind. A way that Germany was pursuing submarine warfare at this point, he saw as a crime against humanity. It was immoral and unjust, and it was not something that he could sit idly by and ignore. It literally became the tipping point for the U.S. entering World War I. He continued on in this address, our object now, as then, is to vindicate the principles of peace and justice in the life of the world, as against selfish and autocratic power, and to set up amongst the really free and self-governed peoples of the world such a concert of purpose and of action as will henceforth ensure the observance of those principles. So again, we're looking at peace and justice as the goals that Wilson had going into World War I. But it wasn't just for an end to the war, it was for a lasting global peace. And literally, he's looking at the underpinning religious foundations that we mentioned previously in the rights of man and the responsibilities of mankind before God. He concludes this address requesting the declaration of war, referring to the United States. He says, "God helping her, she can do no other." And meaning going into war, there's no other option. But no one familiar with church history will miss this reference to Martin Luther. When Luther was on trial for heresy, he was demanded by the religious leaders to recant of what they considered his heresy. And he replied, "Here I stand, I can do no other." So even when requesting a declaration of war, Wilson could not escape his religious heritage. In short, the German submarine warfare against non-combatants was the tipping point. Beyond that point, Wilson could not abstain from action or remain silent. He was morally bound by his obligations to both God and man to take action in the face of injustice. Wilson presented his 14-point plan for peace to Congress on January 8, 1918. 8 of the points related to specific issues having to do with the countries involved in World War I and their territorial boundaries. These are of less concern for our purposes in this video, so we won't go over them. 6 points outlined Wilson's vision for a new world order where everyone could live in peace. 5 of his points included a requirement for open peace negotiation rather than private secret diplomacy. He was so serious about this that he actually requested the press to be present in Paris, in Versailles, during the actual peace negotiations. The other nations didn't quite accept that, so it wasn't quite as open as Wilson had hoped. He also wanted freedom of the seas so that international trade could be carried out and international travel could be carried out without hindrance. He wanted trade equality among all nations so that every nation, whether great or small or rich or poor, had equal opportunity for international trade. He also had a vision for arms reduction. He wanted all nations to reduce their armaments and armies to the minimums necessary for national security. And he also envisioned self-determination for all nations. This was a very strong move against imperial conquests. This obviously before the U.S. Had imperial conquests overtly of its own, or at least Wilson didn't pursue those. So anti-imperialism was a part of the 14 points. The 14th point was the capstone. Wilson did not believe that settlements would be upheld by individual powerful nations, just as he thought the church should hold politicians accountable for moral service. Wilson believed nations needed an organization to hold them accountable to peace. The 14th point states, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. In various settings, this general association of nations was referred to as the League of Peace, the League of Honor, and the League of Nations. As we will see in a few minutes, the name the League of Nations was finally decided upon. There are several religious concepts in the 14 points. We'll list a few that I think are obvious. Wilson posited all the peoples of the world are in effect partners in this interest, and for our own part, we see very clearly that unless justice be done to others, it will not be done to us. The language here applies Christianity's golden rule to international political relationships. Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We see this in Wilson's application to the nations of the world. The quote above also includes the concepts of the brotherhood of mankind due to the fatherhood of God. In the document itself, Wilson consistently uses the term covenant in this address and in other documents. The concept of covenant, as we have seen, is central to Wilson's Presbyterian covenant theology and his Scottish covenanter heritage. For Wilson, the covenant was the highest form of binding agreement. It was solemn and sacred. On January 22, 1917, President Wilson addressed the Senate to present his understanding of the essential terms for peace in Europe. In short, Wilson was presenting what he believed Americans would expect from the peace settlement. He was also selling the idea that the League of Nations would not violate U.S. values and principles. He stated, the elements of that peace must be elements that engage the confidence and satisfy the principles of American governments, elements consistent with their political faith and with the practical convictions which the peoples of America have once for all embraced and taken to defend. If the peace presently to be made is to endure, it must be a peace made secure by the organized major force of mankind. So Wilson here realizes that peace treaties can be made, but they'll only be enforced if there is a significant coalition of nations to guarantee that they are adhered to or followed. But he really focuses here on the principles and values of the American people. As we've already seen, many of those were religious values, and the underpinnings of the U.S. worldview, the U.S. American value system, was religious in its origins. Wilson also needed to convince the like-minded nations of Europe to accept the League of Nations idea. He formally presented the idea at the second plenary session of the Peace Conference in Paris on January 25, 1919. Wilson proclaimed, we have assembled for two purposes, to make the present settlements which have been rendered necessary by this war, and also to secure the peace of the world, not only by the present settlements, but by the arrangements that we shall make at this conference for its maintenance. The League of Nations seems to me to be necessary for both purposes. He continued, we are assembled under very peculiar conditions of world opinion. I may say without straining the point that we are not representatives of governments, but representatives of people. It will not suffice to satisfy governmental circles anywhere. It is necessary that we should satisfy the opinion of mankind. Wilson continued, making clear his priority of liberty and democracy. He desired to create a new world order in which war, especially world war, would never again occur. For this reason, he advocated establishing processes rather than mere decisions to maintain the peace. He concludes, or later in the address he includes, the United States should feel that its part in this war has been played in vain if there ensued upon it merely a body of European settlements. It would feel that it could not take part in guaranteeing those European settlements unless that guarantee involved the continuous superintendence of the peace of the world by the associated nations of the world. Wilson's desire is clear here. The associated nations of the world, the League of Nations, would include the leadership of the United States. He continued later in that address, we regard a League of Nations as the keystone of the whole program which expressed our purposes and ideals in this war in which the associated nations have accepted as the basis of the settlement. Wilson, speaking on behalf of the American people, strongly stated that the League of Nations was the will of the American people, not merely of the nation's leaders. He stated, we would not dare compromise upon any matter as the championing of this thing, this peace of the world, this attitude of justice, this principle that we are the masters of no people, but are here to see that every people in the world shall choose its own masters and govern its own destinies, not as we wish, but as it wishes. Wilson used little religious language or imagery in this address in Paris. As we have seen, the underlying religious principles are present. It is a powerful and eloquent speech. It is worth taking the time to read. Despite Wilson's assurances to the associated nations in Paris that the League of Nations was the will of the American people, the United States did not even join the League. The U.S. Senate did not vote to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and therefore the U.S. did not join the League of Nations. Many reasons for this rejection have been proffered. Among them, one finds both political and religious reasons. Here are a few. Americans had no guarantees that the League would accept the validity of the U.S. Constitution, which led to concerns regarding America's continuing sovereignty. Americans did not want the United States to be subservient to an international organization. They wanted to preserve America's autonomy in the world system. Membership in the League of Nations made no allowances for the diplomatic doctrine of the United States, leading to concerns over America's freedom to act autonomously in foreign affairs. Some Americans feared that the League would attempt to regulate religion, which would contravene the separation of church and state. Even though Wilson shared many religious values with other politicians and the majority of Americans, the political and religious concerns regarding the League of Nations proved insurmountable. Wilson founded the League of Nations, but the United States did not join the League. As founder of the League of Nations, President Wilson won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919. Wilson believed his challenge, his divine purpose, was to fix a broken world system by replacing it with a new world order grounded in Christian principles of love and brotherhood, so that war would never again be the outcome of disagreements between nations. The 14-point plan for world peace melded Wilson's political and religious philosophies. The League of Nations was designed to mediate conflicts, resolving them before war erupted. Functioning ideally, the League of Nations would have eliminated war. Wilson was an imperfect but sincere follower of the Prince of Peace, seeking a new world order of God-pleasing, peaceful coexistence among the peoples of all nations. The content of this video draws from all of the items on this bibliography. I did not cite specific quotations, but they can be found, specific quotations, in the actual items of the bibliography.